Good afternoon and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another webinar. My name is Azim Rashid, and with me today I have two of my colleagues from Verify 365. We have Mev,
Nice to
and
meet you.
we also have Claire.
Yeah.
And today's webinar will be looking at how law firms can enhance their client onboarding using digital solutions, with a particular focus on compliance and anti-money laundering. And we'll be splitting this webinar into three general topics, looking at, to begin with, traditional verification methods. So how law firms have been verifying clients over the last 5 or 10 decades versus what we've seen over the last couple of years. So that's automated digital verifications. And then we'll also be looking at compliance. So what the regulators say about using digital verifications and some of the enhanced due diligence that's set out by the likes of the SRA. And then finally, we'll have a look at our digital solution, Verify 365, focusing on how that serves as a client onboarding solution and some of the features and benefits of using a client onboarding solution. So moving very quickly on to the first topic, looking at traditional verifications. Mev, coming to you first, what are your thoughts on some of the issues around using a manual verification process?
I think let's first define what we mean by a traditional verification compared to, say, non-traditional verification. A traditional verification, usually, generally speaking, is a process where a client comes into a law firm with their official documents, whether that be a bank account, a utility bill, so on and so forth, and has them essentially photocopied by an admin staff paralegal, rarely the actual fee earner, and then essentially just slotted on into the file without actually being verified. Okay. Along with this, you have the other traditional method, which is the client might send their documents, usually through an email, again, the same passport, driving license, or utility bill, and then that might be ran through some sort of electronic system that then spits out a pass or fail value, and then that's again just stored into the file should the law firm be audited or the file reviewed at any point. The problem with these types of verifications is there's no real verification going on, right? Even with the use of electronic systems, that where you manually input the data, what are we verifying there? Nothing other than the document number, right? You'll put in the passport number, and it'll spit out that this passport number does exist. There's no verification if that passport is real or not. There's no verification if that passport belongs to the client that brought it in. Again, they might run the address through a system and it'll spit out a pass or fail. But again, usually what that means is that address exists, and finding a real address is no different to than just Google searching a general kind of residential or commercial property. So there's no real verification process going on there. The second problem is the actual speed at which that takes. When you ask a client to come in, they don't come in immediately. They'll need to either book a half day off or a full day off and come into the practice at a day that suits them to get it verified. That might be a day or two, that might be a week later on. And then what happens is usually they'll forget some sort of document, or you'll need an extra document which they haven't brought with them. So they'll have to go away, come back a week later, so on and so forth. And all this does, it protracts the AML process unnecessarily over a period of weeks when it could be done in just a few minutes. So those two are the biggest problems with the traditional method of verification. It's very, very slow, and there's generally no real verification going on.
Okay, yeah, so it's two very big issues, you could say then. Claire, from a compliance perspective, this has been the way that most law firms have always done it, right? So they've always kind of had a manual verification process. Just talk to us a bit about, from a compliance perspective, what are some of the risks associated with that?
Yes, well, there are risks associated with it, and it could be that they're not completely verifying their client just by checking those details, whereby if they biometric check, then they are checking against the NFC chip, and they are also meeting the safe harbor standard with ID verifications.
Okay. Now, I mean, we have recently there was a joint statement made by LawTech UK and the regulators where it was put forward that digital ID verification is seen as almost a second best option, right? So it's looked at as a secondary option as opposed to the go-to solution for onboarding clients. Why do you think law firms would see that as a second option? Do you have any thoughts on that, Claire?
Yeah, well, it could just be that it's in their procedures to do it that way, and it's been a procedure that the practice has in place, whereby if the practice was to, as part of their firm-wide assessment, to look at mitigating risk, it might not mitigate risk the traditional way, and whereby if they were to maybe reassess their practice-wide assessment, they would then identify that there is a risk in that.
Okay, Bev, one of the things that was highlighted as a key barrier was that law firms felt that they shouldn't be outsourcing and that they would be outsourcing the AML responsibilities if they were to use a third-party verification system. What are your thoughts on that? Is that a barrier?
If it is, it shouldn't be, because there's no real outsourcing going on there. The use of an external system to carry out your AML check is no different to using Outlook for your emails or Word or something equivalent for your documents, right? It is a system that helps to amplify and increase the security and compliance around the firm's AML. So if it is a genuine feeling of the responsibility of verifying the AML goes to an external party, and they want to keep that control, then that's not the case. The SRA would say, regardless of what system you use, whether traditional or more modern systems like Verify 365, the onus still is on the solicitor. The main difference is through a system that, through a client onboarding system that speeds up the process and is more compliant, you make the whole client experience better for the client and just goodwill.
Okay, no, so the responsibility still remains on the lawyer to do the necessary checks, but a software like Verify 365 is complementing what would be the normal process and help improving the client experience along the way too. Okay, the next question I have is one that was asked before the webinar started was, is it possible for the manual verifications to be as accurate as digital verifications? Now, I know we've touched on this slightly, looking at whether the documents can be genuine and also validate those documents. What are some of the other things in which you mentioned practically? Often it's receptionists or admin staff who look at those documents. Is that also affecting the accuracy of those verifications?
Absolutely. So verification tech is built to be as close as possible to the truth, right? There's a very small margin of error. And although we as people like to think we'd be able to tell, a fraudster from a genuine person, the fact is we can't. If we could, money laundering wouldn't be a problem, and identity fraud wouldn't be a problem. So we're not very good at it. The benefits of systems like this in reducing the margin of error is that they do biometric face scans. You can look at two identical twins and not be able to tell the difference because they look similar, whereas a biometric facial scan would be because it's looking past just hair color, eye color, general shape of the face. It's looking beyond that, looking at very minute details that tell the difference between person A and person B. Along with this technology, Claire mentioned NFC technology, proof of ownership of the document. I remember reading months ago, I can't quite remember how long, there was an article in the BBC about a gang, it happened to be in Birmingham, a Birmingham gang that were ordering real passports with lookalikes, and then when the passports arrived, they would essentially just swap the images over. The idea being that it would look like their passport, but it's not their passport, it's someone else's passport, and they're using it because they have their image. Verification technology like this pinpoints those little discrepancies, especially NFC technology, it finds those fake documents and shouts it out. And just looking at a passport, knowing there's an NFC chip in there, or just looking at a driving license with a little with no watermark, you wouldn't be able to tell if it's real or not. But verification technology is built to make sure that we're able to sort the wheat from the chaff, as it were.
No, it makes perfect sense, and I think there's also the benefits of just the legal sector and the legal community staying up to date with the technology too. And often, I think you may get law firms from different areas of law that feel that it's unnecessary for them to use something like a digital verification system. What is the difference from law firms who are, for example, family lawyers predominantly, or those that practice in company formation or trusts or conveyancing even? Claire, just share some light on the need to verify the clients and how that differs from different firms.
Yes, well, again, it goes back to the firm-wide risk assessment, really, because law firms are under an obligation to meet the requirements of the AML regulation 18. And by that, then, when they conduct a firm-wide risk assessment, they can look at the client, the type of client, the countries, the geographical risk, and the products and services that the law firm provides, the types of transactions, and the delivery channels, because all of those pose a risk. So, like, for example, the delivery channel, if it's online, and they're not actually meeting the client, then they would have to that would form a high risk for the firm. So it might not necessarily be the area of law. It's the actual type of transaction that would then be assessed to see, would this be a high risk or is it considered a low risk to the practice? And again, it just goes back to the firm-wide risk assessment, and that identifies in advance to law firms what is considered to be a risk. Even the type of transaction, they don't necessarily need to be transferring funds, but to have an involvement in it, it could pose a risk really to the practice. That's whereby law firms that have accreditations such as Lexel or CQS look to maybe mitigate risk or analyse it in more detail, really, just to meet their obligations.
Okay, so who you act for is just as important as, or if not more important, as to what area you practice in. So it's more about understanding who you act for and the way that you deliver your services. But just staying on that point with you, Claire. I mean, so we have a lot of law firms at the moment who are working on a hybrid model or working from home completely. And of course, that was massively stemmed from the COVID-19 pandemic. What was the regulators' point of view and perspective on that? So did the regulations change, or was there a big kind of change in terms of how they should be practicing and verifying clients?
Yep, well, again, it just forms part of the firm's policies, controls and procedures, really, and to firms to identify the risks, have the assessment done in advance, whereby if they are checking with their client and they're not meeting them, then they would have to then consider that to be a high risk and to further obtain information from the client just to verify them as part of the onboarding. So that.
Now, Mev, I know you have previously done webinars and a lot of work with the Land Registry, and you are a bit of a specialist on the Safe Harbor Digital ID standard. How is the digital ID standard set out by the Land Registry? How does that tie in with what we're discussing today regarding AML and compliance?
Sure. So the SRA leaves quite a wide margin in terms of what solicitor firms can do to remain compliant when it comes to the CDD side of things. And although this is good because the SRE accommodate for both law firms that have millions of turnover to law firms that have tens of thousands of revenue, this is good for them. However, conveyancing as an area is the most riskiest specialism of of any kind of lawyer job because of the amount of client money that you're dealing with. And since HMLR, the land registry, is directly involved in the conveyancing process, they've decided to put out their own framework that conveyancers, I will say optionally, but is being pushed quite heavily, can follow. The framework, or the digital ID framework, essentially sets out how conveyancers should ID their clients to ensure maximum security for both for their sake and HMLR's sake, and also to avoid any kind of future repercussions in terms of the client turning out to be fake. The framework really sets out the steps by obtaining the client's documents, validating, making sure that the client's documents are real, and making sure that the client is the owner of that document. Now, in the UK, that's usually done through some sort of NFC chip. So that in itself provides more security both for conveyancers and HMLR, and it should feed into conveyancing departments across the UK on how they approach AML, because the land registry is pushing it quite heavy.
Okay.
Just going back to the point with regards to the various different specialisms, and I hope you don't mind, Claire, about the various different specialisms and the types of verifications they should run. Although, Claire, you did a fantastic job about explaining about the firm right risk assessment, I think what I would like to point out from our point of view, as we do offer verifications, is the role of client money. Those clients that do essentially pose a higher risk and the solicitor firm that is dealing with their client money do need to go into depth about understanding where that money is coming from. So simply verifying your client, their address, and running a basic source of funds isn't sufficient. Understanding where that source of wealth is coming from for clients that are high risk based on either the firm-wide risk assessment or based on the criteria set out by the SRA is very important. For those specialisms that don't deal with client monies, family, immigration, those kinds, the ability to validate the money is not quite irrelevant, but it's non-existent because they're not dealing with it. So just making sure that the client is who they say they are, I should say, and reside where they say they reside, i.e. an address verification, is sufficient.
So they still need to verify and validate the client, of course, and using a digital solution can help them do that. Then is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And in terms of on a practical, from a practical point of view, implementing technology that can support this, how difficult or how easy is that, Nev?
It's a good question. It depends on the firm, but realistically, it doesn't have to be difficult. In the case management world, everyone is talking about cloud-based case management systems, and all that really means is you instead of having the server in your building on your premises, it's hosted somewhere far away where you don't have to worry about it, and you access it through some sort of web browser, right? Yeah. That's true for most technology now. Most is cloud-based. Most only requires a internet connection and the ability to log in, choose which verifications you want to run on a client, and send it. That's about as complex as it really needs to get for most kind of small to medium sized law firms. For those large to enterprise large law firms, they might want something more bespoke. The process might be more complex, but the reality is most will only need an internet connection.
Okay. And is there a split up in terms of, for conveyancing in particular, where you could see more than just law firms use this technology? Is it applicable to agents, estate agents, different types of finance companies involved?
Absolutely. As a regulated industry, legal and law firms have the responsibility to run their AML verifications. Finance is already heavily regulated, and they have their duties to carry out AML verifications. There's some slight nuances in what needs to be verified, but strictly speaking, there's lots of commonality there. Estate agents currently aren't regulated or aren't as heavily regulated, I believe, but there are plans for that to come in pretty quickly, I believe, next year or so. And also with the Law Society working with estate agents on their new TA6 form, If no one's heard of that, this is predominantly for conveyancing, granted. That's where the TA6 form in its current form is being split, where one half will be done by the estate agents and the other half will be done by conveyancers. The ability for software to be multi-channel, let's call it, where they can connect estate agents, finance, companies like accountants and legal law firms is going to become more important. That's not to say they shouldn't specialize, but that is to say that the systems will need an ability to work with other areas rather than just legal.
I think we'll come on to that in a very short while about how client onboarding and what different things should be included within client onboarding systems in order to simplify that initial process when you do you need to verify a new client or carry out your due diligence. Claire, is there anything from the SRA that you have come across or Lexel that you feel is important to share from a regulatory standpoint? Is there any new changes with regards to? Yeah,
so in March this year, there was a new statutory instrument whereby it just identified what would be a high-risk country. So that's important really for law firms to keep updated with regulatory changes, just to really comply with their obligations. Part of Lexel accreditation as well for law firms that are Lexel accredited. It's again important to have the firm-wide risk assessment and just as part of their onboarding to obtain the source of funds, identify their clients, and obviously where the need be to assess the risk as to whether that's a high risk or a low risk to the practice.
Okay. All right, fantastic. All right, so we're going to move on to the solution Verify 365, so our system. We're going to be talking a little bit about how it serves law firms as a client onboarding solution and go through some of the features and some of the pains that it aims to solve for law firms. So, Mev, over to you. Just tell me, a solution like Verify 365, how does it help with onboarding new clients for a law firm?
Sure. So I mentioned at the start the traditional verification process where clients might come in or they might send their documents into the law firm to be verified, so on and so forth. The burden very much on that is both on the law firm and the client. The burden on the law firm is to either photocopy or run the documents through an electronic system to make sure they're verified. The burden is on the client is to make sure that they can, one, take a day off to come into the office, or two, that they are sending all the proper documents that they will need or the lawyer will need at some point. It's a very, very protracted process, as I mentioned, and not very slick at all. And the fact is, currently, it doesn't, for conveyancers at least, it doesn't comply with HMLR digital ID standard, meaning no conveyancing matters can gain safe harbor status. The way the Verify 365 works is that it removes both the onus on the client. The client does have to complete the verification, but it's not onerous in any way, meaning that they can complete it in their own time in the evening, and the process only takes 5 minutes. There have been instances where lawyers send verifications at, say, 10 o'clock, and by 10:35, they already have their client verification report in their hand.
How long does it take for the actual verification? Like, if I was, as a client, if I was to be given a link from a solicitor, my solicitor, to verify myself and to do all of the checks necessary, what's the time frame for me to complete that on average?
A basic ID verification can be complete in 30 seconds. A full verification can be complete under 4 minutes. So the whole process at most will take 240 seconds from start to finish on a full verification. And the solicitor can have all that information in a nice little PDF verification report in their hand, in the file, about 2 minutes after the client submits the verification report. The system is designed to be slick and seamless. For one reason, I always state to lawyers I speak to, the AML process, the ID verification process, it is a very important aspect of the matter, because if you don't do it, you really shouldn't be proceeding with the matter, and you can't proceed with the matter. But because it's such an important aspect, it doesn't need to be this big task. It can be a very slick and seamless task, and Verify 365 does that. And we've done that because we know that our technology can verify clients pretty quickly and their monies pretty quickly, without protracting the process unnecessarily.
When the information comes back to the lawyer, and you say that comes through within under 10 seconds of the client completing it, how long would it take for a lawyer to then digest that information? So are they getting tons of pages coming through? Is it a simple report? How long would it take to digest and then actually make a decision based on the findings from that result?
Mm-hmm. So AML in its current form is very much a tick box exercise. Can you get the document? Can you prove the document? You have the document, passport, say, photocopy in the file, so on and so forth. We appreciate that this is like this because lawyers, they don't really want to spend time verifying, documents and such, and spending lots of time on it. So we've designed our verification report to be very quick in digesting the information, so much so that by the time the client has verified themselves and 10 seconds later the lawyer has the verification report in their hands, they will have a very clear pass or fail next to each section, i.e. the ID, the address, finances, so on and so forth. And then for the finances specifically, they can go into more detail as we break down transactions and give them the client's financial information.
And is that information presented through open banking you mentioned, right?
Correct, yes.
Just share some light on the open banking then for those that don't know. How does that work? Are you asking for people to share, the mobile app logins? I mean, how does it work?
Absolutely. So online banking might scare some people, but it's actually something that we all do, right? If you have your bank's app on your mobile, that's essentially open banking. Open banking is not quite. Open banking is the connecting of third-party sources to banks with permission from the bank owner, i.e. the person whose bank account it is. So no system could ever go to, say, Claire's bank account and have access to her financial information without Claire saying it is okay and without there being some sort of time restriction on when that will expire.
What are the benefits of having that submitted digitally then, to be able to get that information digitally?
So few people, myself included, get our bank statements through the post anymore. Most of us are, environmentally conscious. We don't want to be wasting paper. We get our bank statements along with our bills digitally, so on and so forth. Most solicitors will still ask for bank statements in paper form to be submitted for them if they don't have online banking, that is. What that means is we as the client have to go ahead, print that off, print about 3 months worth off, go into the firm, send that off, so on and so forth. And it's just it's not a difficult task, but it's just an arduous task for something very simple. Online banking essentially over a course of seconds connects to the client's bank account, pulls in the information that the lawyer needs, categorizes it, date order, income is now going to, essentially makes both the client's life easier and the lawyer's life easier.
And is there an aspect there where documents can't be manipulated and figures can't be manipulated because the information is being pulled in from the actual source of information, so it's coming directly from a banking app, from the bank itself? Surely the majority of anti-money laundering or identity fraud cases, it's got to be doing wonders in terms of preventing from that actually taking place.
Yeah, absolutely. When you ask your client to bring in 3-6 months worth of bank statements, 3 or 6 months worth, I should say, they have the ability to print it off and manipulate those documents, as you said. And it's really not that difficult to do if you know what you're doing. And let's be clear, most of these people that are money laundering do know what they are doing when it comes to this. So the fact that we're getting the information directly from the bank, I doubt any one person could manipulate, say, Barclays or RBS in any such way to falsify their accounts easily. It would be, it'd be impossible. So getting that information directly from the source definitely does help combat money laundering. And also, if your client is hesitant to provide that information, it just prompts the solicitor to ask further questions of why they are being that way, why they aren't providing that financial information. And sometimes it is just a sensitive matter. Other times it can be a bit more nefarious.
Is there? I mean, is there a is it just the main banks that have this feature, or is it sort of all the banks?
No, most banks support, even from online banks like Monzo and Revolut to newish banks like Tesco Bank and Starling to the kind of legacy banks like Barclays and RBS and so on and so forth. Most use online banking because that is just the way that consumers are changing, not just consumers of the legal services, but consumers as a whole, as part of the UK, New Zealand, Australia, both are becoming open banking ready. America is slowly becoming open banking ready. Most of us don't want to go into a branch. Most of us don't want to print off bank statements. If we could do it all through our phone on our app in a couple of seconds and a few clicks, we will. Why? Because that's just our habits now.
Yeah. So it's all about ease of use, convenience. And as you said, I think there is a lot of different countries. I was reading earlier today that I think this week Saudi Arabia is launching their open banking too. So it's definitely something that's a growing trend, a growing tool to use for identifying information. I've got a couple of questions here then. One being the cost element of using a system like this. A question here, just say, how much does it cost to use a digital ID verification system? Is that a barrier? Do people think that this costs a lot more than it does? Maybe just share a bit of light on that, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Price can be a barrier, but price is a barrier because the alternatives seem compliant and seem cheaper, when in actual fact they're not in both instances, right? Asking your client to come into the office is free, but the opportunity cost of losing clients that want a seamless, easy way of working with a lawyer is lost because they'll go to a different firm that uses a system like ours, right? Having the client send in their documents and for you to run it through an electronic system, usually that just costs a few pounds. Again, that seems cheap on the surface, but again, no real verification, not really compliant, and just useless, generally speaking as well. Our system as a whole, well, most electronic verification systems as a whole aren't that expensive pieces of software, because most can be charged back as a client to disbursement, but also the software itself isn't that expensive. Ours is in the region of £10 to £15 per verification, depending on what you run. So it's really not that expensive at all.
Okay. A question here for you, Claire. Someone's asking, how do I know that a ID verification system is compliant? So it's going to be okay for them to use as a law firm?
Yes, so they need to then check that it's safe harbor compliant, whereby that means the onus and responsibility is not on the actual law firm. Then they've as much as they can to verify the checks and just to mitigate risk where they can, really.
So to use safe harbor as it should be, but to use that as a benchmark for all law firms who are looking to use a digital ID verification, then that will give them comfort in knowing that they're carrying out sort of the highest due diligence and being compliant.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And maybe just finally, before we look for some more questions and end the webinar, in terms of a client onboarding system and mirroring into the fact of AML and compliance, what are some of the features and things that you see necessary for a client onboarding system for law firms? Is integrations important? And also, what are some of the additional features in terms of streamlining that process? What do you think an ideal client onboarding system or process looks like?
Sure. So client onboarding goes further than just anti-money laundering, right? That is the first step. Before you can even work on a matter, you have to get a client to sign a client care letter, and in some instances, you might ask them for payment on account, and then you might run some searches if it's a conveyancing matter before you even actually get into the nitty-gritty of the actual work. So all these things need to be looked at in a complete client onboarding system. And the ability to have all this work seamlessly through some sort of workflow or such is very important. And that's what we're working on, my team is working on. What we also need to keep in mind is, regardless of how seamless and fantastic we can make client onboarding systems, they are the initial part of a matter. The actual matter management side of things, usually, generally speaking, should be done in a case management system.
Yeah.
So the integration into case management systems is going to be very, very important. And because there's a whole plethora of case management systems in the market currently, both UK wide and internationally, making sure that systems like ours integrate into each major one is going to be very important. Because although we want to make the law firm's clients experience good for them, so they generate goodwill for the law firm and continue to use their services, we and all other software providers want to make sure that the client experience for the law firm with our solution is also as seamless and nice as possible as well.
Okay, thank you. And so moving away from sort of traditional verification methods can be difficult. It can be something new for law firms to try out, and many of them would have worked in this way for many years. What are some of the top tips you have for them who are thinking about making the change or are using a system that's not safe harbor compliant? What would be your top tips for them?
I think we should make this distinction between those that are just safe harbor compliant, because that is predominantly conveyancers, and AML, digital AML verifications can be used for everyone, not just conveyancers. My general tips for everyone, regardless, is really look into the system and make sure that your clients would be happy to use them.
Yeah.
By this, I mean, if you feel that one or two might make a huff, then you need to just decide accordingly. But the way the consumer trends are moving towards is that most clients would be happy doing this. So make sure your clients are happy and make sure that your new clients coming on board are okay with this type of technology. I can't imagine they won't be. Next is, don't let price be a barrier. I know that sounds ridiculous, especially for those kind of sole practitioners that do have to count the pounds and pennies to make sure they stay afloat. But if you're comparing, Verify 365 to asking your clients to come in, it's not a like for like. It's not oranges to oranges. It's apples to oranges. And even then, it's moldy old apples versus a brand new shiny orange type situation. So don't let price be a barrier. If you like the system and it will fit your needs and your practice's needs, then don't be afraid to speak to the provider and work out some sort of deal. And generally is the third and general suggestion is make sure you have buy-in from the firm, or at least a department. If a conveyancing department wants to use a software like Verify 365, absolutely, that's great. But you get the most out of these kind of solutions when the entire practice is using it, because then there's a consistent type of quality across the entire practice without this kind of hodgepodge process being used in, say, family, and then a nice sleek system being used in conveyancing. So those are my three kind of general tips. For conveyancers specifically, just make sure the system is safe harbor compliant and does deal with financial transactions, being able to analyze them and make sure that the information is clear, concise, and readily available.
Yeah. Okay. And Claire, just coming to you, any tips that you have? I mean, we're coming out of the pandemic now, but is putting in a system like this future-proofing your firm so that if something was to occur in the future, you would have systems that allow you to just work and continue to work? What are some of your top tips in terms of from a compliance perspective for law firms who are looking to take on an electronic verification system?
Yes. So to make sure that they have reviewed it, it fits into their policies, controls, and procedures, and to ensure that they carry out the risk assessments, really, and make sure then that the ID verification meets the standard as required by their obligations.
Okay. No, I agree. I think the important thing to also remember is that it's understand that it's there to help them. work better, work faster, and stay more compliant. So it's in their favor. But that's all that we have today. I'm just going to see if we've got any further questions. It doesn't seem like we have, so we'll end the webinar there. Thank you so much, Mev. Thank you, Claire. Thank you to everybody who tuned in. If you have any further questions, if you have anything that you'd like to follow up on, please feel free to reach out directly through LinkedIn. We'll be happy to help. And thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.